Afternoon, everyone. Today we have the extreme honor and privilege of having Professor Satish Deshpande with us. Professor Deshpande will talk about can there be dialogue across castes? Satish Deshpande is a professor of sociology at the Department of Sociology, Delhi School of Economics. His research interests include caste and class inequalities, contemporary social theory, politics, and theory of the social sciences, and South-South interactions. He is the author of Contemporary India, A Sociological View, and Untouchability in Rural India. He has co-edited with Patricia Oberoi and Nandini Sundar, Anthropology in the East, Founders of Indian Sociology and Anthropology, and Class Inequalities, Contemporary Social Theory, Politics and History of the Social Sciences, and South-South Interactions. You're welcome, Professor Satish Deshpande. You have up to 2 hours for this session, and you're welcome to conduct it however you like to. So over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Don't scare the audience by saying 2 hours and all that. They will all feel already start feeling oppressed. I intend to speak only for about 40 minutes, after which we can have discussion. Now, just to make sure that I'm getting this right, first of all, let me say that I know nothing about the organization as such, about Indialog as an organization. So I'm a complete outsider. I'm here only because a friend and colleague of mine recommended my name, and he called me up and said that this is a good group and that I should go and talk to them. And I agreed. So that's why I'm here. So I don't have any background information about other than what was I found out more after I was sent some information. That's where I'm coming from as a complete outsider. Now, about you, I know that there are about 20, 25 of you in the audience, that most of you are Indian. Just a few of you are from other countries, some 5 or 6 are from other countries, and that most of you have a social science background. Am I right in assuming all of that? Yes? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so that's where I'm starting from. So let's get started with things that you may have already done, gone over several times, given the nature of the organization and the kinds of talks, a few of which I have been fortunate enough to see. Let's get started with what is dialogue. Anybody wants to start off? You see, this is my way of keeping you awake, because if I keep on talking, then any reasonable person would go to sleep after lunch. So what is dialogue? It's not a trick question. I just want to get quickly, communicating with you and make sure that we are on the same page and so on. So
good afternoon, sir. This is Sabiha More from Mumbai. I am an associate professor in one of the colleges affiliated to Mumbai University. We basically are teacher trainers. Okay. Dialogue in the simplest term means interaction between two people on the same level, respecting both the partners with same dignity and respect. That's all.
All right. All right. Thank you very much. You've already skipped several steps for me, so we can cut this short. The first requirement of dialogue is communication, right? Meaningful communication. That dialogue is different from talking at each other, right? You can have two parties who are just, often we see such situations, who are shouting at each other. Neither side is hearing any the other side. And so there is, a lot is being said, but very little is being understood. So the first requirement of dialogue is meaningful communication. And as Sabina has already pointed out, this is two-way communication. It can't be just one person. Dialogue is by definition more than one. And it has to be, this is the most difficult part, some form of equality or reciprocity at any rate, right? Whether equality is a very difficult thing, actually. I mean, As an idea, it seems very simple, but as we all know, in real life, to actually produce it in society has proved to be very, very complicated. So what we mean by dialogue is a form of communication where two or more parties or sides are involved who are communicating with each other on a reciprocal basis. That is, on a basis that involves give and take, listening as well as speaking, and that this is being done on some reasonable level of equality. Now, we don't want to get into exactly how equal and so on, roughly equal basis. Okay, so if this is dialogue, then my question today, the title of my talk today was, is dialogue across caste possible? So we already know what is dialogue. Now we need to get into what is caste. Now this may, especially for those of you who are not from India, this may be a relatively unknown sort of question. Let's start with this then. What is caste? I mean, since most of you are from India, where do you, for most Indians today, especially the sort of Indians who would be in groups like this, in seminars like this, workshops like this, caste today is visible mostly in three places. Firstly, it's visible in politics and elections. Newspapers are full of them. And when we think of caste, we think of elections. And when we think of elections in India, we think of caste. It's visible in the subject of reservation. The non-Indians would be very amazed to know that this simple word, the word itself is a very simple one, attracts such vehement opinions from most Indians, particularly most middle-class educated Indians who broadly tend to be upper caste, or where the so-called upper castes are overrepresented amongst the educated and the middle class. So the topic of reservation, it refers to quotas for different castes in government jobs and education and things like that, which in India is a very, very emotive issue. And thirdly, we think of caste, Indians think of caste in the context of marriage or community. So even people who say that they don't believe in caste and don't really think much about caste when it comes to getting married, their families would be, by the way, this is, I mean, true for both genders. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female. When you're getting married, caste becomes relevant again, and your family will get involved. And everyone in the world, of course, has heard of the famous Indian arranged marriage and so on. But as you will probably already have discovered if you have spent some time in India, that this is not as simple as it looks. And there are many peculiarly Indian variations on the arranged marriage. There is the arranged love marriage. There is the arranged intercaste marriage sometimes, and so on. So in short, just knowing whether it is arranged or love marriage, etc., it doesn't really help. But the point I'm trying to make is that when it comes to marriage, you think of caste. So you think of caste in politics, in reservation, and in marriage.
Professor,
yes.
May I interrupt you?
Yes.
What is arranged love marriage?
It's when it's already been decided that X will marry Y, and then X and Y are encouraged to fall in love. And they proceed to do so very obediently. Right? This happens. It's very, I mean, it's a very common now thing. It's amusing in a way that in a certain class, in a certain urban class, some segments of this class now feel a little embarrassed saying that their marriage was just arranged. So they like to say that, think that they had something to do, some choice in the matter. And love marriage is basically choice marriage, where you marry by choice. Now, as you know, in society, since most of you from the social sciences, this thing called choice can be very complicated, right? There are many things you are made to choose. And there are many things that you choose without realizing that your choice is actually guided by other things other than just yourself. So the fiction of the individual as the sole author of his or her actions is actually a fiction in most societies, right? Including in societies that are very individualist, considered very few. So an arranged marriage is where families are involved. So the average marriage in India, particularly outside of the urban middle class, is a relationship between families. The two individuals who are getting married are more or less incidental to the whole thing. It's an arrangement that is arrived at between, and it works remarkably well, by the way.
Or sir, if may I interrupt, it is the other way around, that two people fall in love and they want to make their families get involved. So in the time of crisis, they are not alone and they have somebody to blame. That आप तो थे, आपने तो देखा था, मैंने तो आपको बताया था, इसके बावजूद भी आपने ना नहीं बोली थी, तो अब मैंने शादी कर ली और मेरी शादी अगर डूब रही है, तो you please stand by me. Is it the other way around? I just want to put that point.
Yes, but involving the family is possible only if the marriage has is within certain parameters. That is within acceptable range of castes and class. And
no, sir. No, sorry. I am very sorry, sir. The acceptable parameter is only money. I am so sorry to say that. It's only finance. तो लड़का अगर बहुत अच्छा और लड़की बहुत अच्छी है तो सारे parameters accepted हैं, sir. It's like that.
This is your name Sabina or Sabiha?
It is Sabiha. S-A-B-I.
I'm so sorry.
And every year I have a breed of 50 to whom I cater. And most of them fall in the same line because they are all of budding age of marriage, 23 plus. Yes, so I know this, why it happens, and I've been very familiar with this, sir. Thank you very much. Sorry to add to that.
Yes. Sabiha is right, of course, that money matters. Obviously, money matters everywhere, right? It doesn't matter what your nationality is. I'm yet to come across any human society where money doesn't matter. And it can opinions can differ. The degree to which money matters can vary across classes. So for the very poor, money, quote unquote, money means something very different from what money means to rich people who are already rich. Money as such is important to everyone, but what it is and the ways in which it matters can differ a lot. So let's move on. What I wanted to point out was that popular ideas about caste don't necessarily match academic ideas about caste. So in the popular view, what most people think of, they think of caste in these contexts: politics, quotas in jobs and education and so on, and things to do with marriage. There are many academic definitions of caste, and we don't need to spend too much time on them. Effectively, and this is mainly for those who are not from India, caste is defined as a hereditary type of identity that is inherited from one's parents, that used to determine almost every aspect of an individual's life. The individual's occupation, the individual's social status, how much education that individual could have. Of course, gender was another major axis in this, which also had important thing to decisive influence. But caste would decide not only who you would marry, which it to some extent continues to do, but what job you would do, what occupation you would have, and your social status, who you could interact with, who you could not interact with, and so on. So there are various ways of getting to the root of caste and what is the theoretical essence and so on. We are not going to, at least I'm not going to get into all of that. That's my subject actually, and I teach it and so on. But if there are any questions, we can take that up in question and answer session. What I'm interested in saying is that today, to understand caste, we need to know both, have a rough idea at least of what it is, and more importantly, what does it do? what kind of work, so to speak, does this thing called caste do in our society, in Indian society today? If we are able to answer this question, to some extent, we'll also be able to answer in a way that is useful for us, whoever we are. We'll also be able to answer the what is it question. So in other words, I'm saying that the what is it question can get answered if we answer the what does it do question. So what does caste do today? And related to this, what is it? What caste does is it provides identity, a particular kind of identity. Now, simply saying this is not enough. It could be an imposed identity. Your caste identity could be imposed on you. It's not something that you have chosen. But once it is imposed by society, it's such a strong kind of label that you find it very hard to shake it off if it has been imposed on you. It could be a chosen identity, and then you go through life with that identity as your chosen sort of identity. It could be an identity in other senses as well, which we will get to later, slightly more complicated ways. It could form your identity. So first and foremost, caste is today a kind of identity. Secondly, caste is a form of community. We already saw that in terms of marriage, but to broaden that somewhat, caste can be, in one sense, the name for the group of people to which you think you belong, the group of people from whom you can claim help, and the group of people with whom you have the most frequent and the most lasting social relationships. That's what a community is, right? Whatever you might think a community is, caste is also to some extent that thing. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, because this is the part that doesn't get seen very, very clearly, caste is a kind of capital. It's a kind of resource. And I'd like to speak a little bit about this side of caste that doesn't get seen as clearly. Because one belongs to a particular kind of caste, a lot of things follow from it, whether or not one is conscious of it or not. So, for example, the kind of education one might get could be related to caste. It's also, of course, related to class, but it's also significantly related to caste. How other people treat you, and therefore what kind of people you know and what kind of networks that you can call upon. Broadly, many of you may be already familiar with the idea of social capital. So caste is a very important form of social capital in India. And caste is also capital in the sense of the unspoken and often unspeakable, in the sense of you can't even articulate it. Most people who are embodying that kind of capital that caste is would not be able to explain what they are doing. And yet it works beautifully in the sense that your caste identity can give you confidence in social situations or rob you of confidence in social situations in ways that have very little to do with your own ability, really. There is such a thing as individual ability. It varies and so on. But as you all know, ability requires a context in which to produce effects. And that context is a social context. So somebody has just written that they're not being able to hear clearly. Is that true for most of you, or is the audio clear for most of you?
I can hear you properly. About this. Yeah.
Okay, so then that should be sorted out at the individual level. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, right. So a form of identity, a form of community, and a form of capital. That's what we say. So if caste is all of these things, why is it difficult? Or why do we need to ask the question, is dialogue across castes possible? Why can't we assume that it's possible? This is the question that I'll be spending most of the time on. The first answer I'm going to suggest to you is that dialogue across caste is difficult because of two contradictory things. First, caste is whatever else it may be. We have already said so many things that it is, right? In the popular view, in the academic view. But regardless of all of these things, caste is fundamentally a relationship. This is not that easy to keep track of all the time. What do I mean to say when I say that caste is fundamentally a relationship? I mean that it is not an attribute. So a person has height, a person's height measured in centimeters is an attribute of that person. A person's weight measured in kilograms is an attribute of that person. Like that, you can have many other attributes. You can have a good sense of humor. You can have, a very short temper, etc., etc. Right? All of these are attributes that belong to a person or that describe a person. Often we think of caste as an attribute. So-and-so is such and such caste. Just like so-and-so is so many centimeters tall. But caste is not like that. Caste is about a relationship. Caste is whatever your caste is, it produces its effects because of its relational nature. And therefore, there are always two sides, at least two sides to caste. And when we start thinking of it as an attribute, we forget, we start treating it as a thing. And when we treat it as a thing, we can't understand it because it doesn't behave like things ought to behave. And in order to change something about caste, you have to change at least two people, not just one, right? So this is the first thing about caste that makes dialogue difficult, that it is relational. Now, this may seem paradoxical to you because dialogue, as we already saw, is at least two parties, right? So something that is relational should naturally be inclined towards making dialogue easy. But this is the paradox. What becomes the reason why dialogue about caste becomes difficult is precisely because it is relational. It is relational, and yet we treat it as an attribute, and we go into the dialogue, any dialogue that we may be having on caste, we go into it forgetting that it is relational and thinking of it as an attribute. And so the dialogue doesn't work. The second thing about caste is that while it is relational, it is also profoundly asymmetrical. What do I mean by asymmetrical? The simplest meaning is when you look into a good mirror, a clear, sort of well-made mirror, you have an inverted image. What is, when you raise your right hand, the image will look like it is raising its left hand, right? Everybody knows this inverted mirror image. But this inverted image for a good mirror, not a distorted mirror, is symmetrical. Your right hand does not look larger than your left hand, right? So a symmetrical image, even though it is inverted, is easy to understand. Caste is relational. It's like a distorted mirror. You get an inverted image, but the inversion is not the only aspect of the reflection. The more important aspect of the reflection is that it is asymmetrical. So what do I mean by asymmetrical? I mean that some caste identities are what I call hyper visible. That is, they are always visible. They are visible to the extent where they occupy all of your vision, and they make it difficult for you to see other things other than caste about that person. So some caste identities are hyper visible identities. And other caste identities are the opposite. Under certain situations, they can become invisible as caste. They are present, caste is present, caste is doing its work, but the people who are bearers of those kinds of castes don't think of themselves as identified by caste. They don't think they have anything to do with caste, but caste is silently working on their behalf. So for these kinds of caste identities, caste is invisible. For other kinds of caste identities, caste is hyper visible. Because of this combination, caste is relational, yet it is asymmetrical in that certain caste identities are hyper visible, certain others are invisible. Because of this, dialogue across castes is extremely difficult. And in my opinion, it's probably the most difficult kind of dialogue. Even in the India of today, you will understand what I'm saying. Even in the India of today, dialogue across religions is easier than dialogue across castes. Because religious difference is recognized, is not hidden. The differences of caste, the kinds of differences they are, the people who bear those differences themselves refuse to recognize them. And when you don't recognize something, it's very difficult to talk about it. This is the basic sort of thesis that I'm proposing to you. And obviously, you should be able to argue back. You may not necessarily be convinced by it, and so on. Let me explain a little bit more and give you some examples. But in terms of content, this is my argument. Caste is fundamentally relational, but it is an asymmetric relationship. And the main aspect of the asymmetry is the contrast between the uneven contrast between hypervisibility and invisibility. And this makes dialogue across caste very difficult. Let me give you an example. All of this, we academics don't realize how abstract we are, even when we are being very abstract. It's a disease, right? I mean, it's an occupational hazard. So let me try and become more concrete. And what could be more concrete than popular jokes, right? Even Sigmund Freud thought that jokes were very useful evidence, that you could learn a lot from jokes. So let me tell you this joke. I use this all the time. So if you have ever heard me speak before and are already feeling groaning, I sort of beg your pardon. But it works very well, and it's a very good example. And that's why, as a teacher, see, one of the curses of a teacher is repetition. You have to do the same thing many times across your life, in every semester, and so on. And you are reluctant to give up things that work well. That's why I'm sticking to this joke. This joke is from 2007, 2008, when the OBC reservation. For the non-Indians, it's a very big expansion of the quota scheme to include a very large number of castes that had not yet been included in the quota system. amounting to about more than 40%, little more than 40% of the population of India. And as you know, any percent of the population of India is a big deal, and 40% is a very big deal. So in those terms, it was a big deal, but it was also a big deal in ideological and political terms. So around 2007-8, this joke was put on the internet that India decides to send a mission to the moon. So as soon as this decision, remember this is a joke, the mission to the moon is announced, immediately there is political squabbling starts as to what are to be the quotas, which caste will get which quotas. And it's decided that, let's say 8 seats will go to the OBCs, 6 seats will go to these are all names of caste, official caste designations. So 8 seats will go to the OBCs, 6 seats will go to the SCs, 3 seats will, how many are there? 8, 6, 14, 4 seats will go to the scheduled tribes. And if there is still room left, 2 astronauts will also be sent. This is supposed to be a joke, right? So everybody already, at least the Indians already understand the joke. And no prizes for guessing whether this joke was invented and circulated amongst the upper castes or the lower castes. The point, however, the reason why I find this joke very effective, because it contains a very deep sociological insight, is because the caste of the astronauts is never mentioned. Everybody else, their caste is being mentioned, and nothing else about them is being mentioned. But for these 2, nobody amongst all of you will be in any doubt as to their caste. What do you think their caste will be? Obviously, they are going to be upper castes. Right? But for these people, they have a caste. We know that they have a caste, but we don't see their caste. We only see their qualifications. And even though this is a joke, even jokes have to have a certain logic. So if India was indeed sending a mission to the moon, they're not going to pick up anybody off the street to send them to the moon, right? So the people who are occupying those different reserved categories will also have to have some qualifications. But we can't see their qualifications. They're not visible to us. We only see their caste. So hyper visible means this. For some people, or rather for some castes, only that caste is visible. So if you are that caste, nothing else about you matters to much of society. You might be very talented, you might be an idiot. Doesn't matter. In either case, it's your caste that is visible to others. Same for the other side, but in an asymmetrical way. You have a caste, but your caste is such that it can be overwritten, or rather it is always overwritten by your qualifications. If you are in a situation of this kind, it is impossible for people of one group, of the invisible group, to talk to the people of the hypervisible group and expect to be understood. Because for one side, there is no problem. Caste doesn't matter. Right? This is the irony of it. The next time you come across somebody who says they have no caste, there is a 99% probability that that person belongs to the upper castes, or at least has they were born in as upper caste people. This is nothing peculiar about caste. It's the same for any axis of power. Now, when a rich man says, when a rich man or woman says, from today, I will not think of myself as rich. I will think of myself as just another person. In fact, I may even think of myself as a poor person, right? When a rich person does this, they can do it. And society will say, oh, what a great person this is. They are saying, you know, they are giving up the advantages of their wealth. The more cynical will say, he thinks he's or she thinks she's not really rich. Well, we all know what that means. But since she's rich or he's rich, let's not get into trouble. Let's humor this person and say that we believe whatever they are saying about themselves. Why? Precisely because rich people have privileges. Now, if the same thing a poor person tries to do, a poor person says, from today, I will think of myself as rich. What do you think is going to happen? Right? Within an hour, society will remind you who you really are. Right? So whoever is on the, you might think of yourself as a king or as a very rich and so on. No, it doesn't matter. Right? Same holds for any axis. Take the gender axis. In most every society, I think, men are more powerful than women. So if a man goes around saying, I don't think of myself as masculine anymore, and I don't think I will refuse all the excuse me, privileges of maleness, society might humor that person. But if a woman goes around saying that I do not believe that I'm a woman or I'm in any way disadvantaged by my gender, I will behave exactly like men behave, society will very quickly tell that woman that you may think whatever you like, but you remain a woman. You can multiply these examples. So the general point being, whoever is at the weaker end of the power axis doesn't get to choose whether they are visible or invisible in society, and they don't get to choose the manner or degree of their visibility. On the other hand, one of the advantages of being powerful in society is that you get to choose whether you're visible in society, the manner in which you're visible to society. You get to choose this. This is one of the perks of privilege. So for a certain class from within caste groups, basically upper class people within the upper castes in India, over, let's say, the last 3 generations, now probably 4, it has become possible for this specific set of people to think of themselves as casteless. And I offer myself as an example. I'm a perfect example of this cultivated castelessness or acquired castelessness. My position as where I am today is historically due to caste. My grandfather was a landowner, not because of anything else, but because of his caste. And because my grandfather was a landowner, he managed to sell some land to educate my father to become an engineer at a time when it was better to be an engineer than a landowner. So my father became an engineer. And because he became an engineer, different kinds of opportunities were available to me. And by this time, my generation, we are able to grow up with all those advantages, but without a sense of caste identity, even though our advantages are directly related to caste in the historical sense. So I could say truthfully, and I did say to myself and say to others after I became an adult, let's say at the age of 16, 17, until I was almost, until 1991, when the Mandal agitation happened, that's when I was forced to look at myself again from a very different perspective. And it was a major shock to me to discover that whatever I may have thought of myself, caste thought of me differently. That my thinking of myself as being casteless did not prevent me from embodying a certain caste identity. So during the period when I thought that I was casteless, it was impossible for me to have any dialogue on caste. And that is the same situation in which large numbers are today, because the links between caste and privilege get obscured. The links between caste and disprivilege are well known. They are talked about all the time. This is another source of asymmetry. Privilege is much harder to talk about usefully. What do I mean by that? You will have countless examples of people admitting, confessing to their privilege, even saying they feel guilty about it and so on, right? Lamenting almost their privilege. But this is not helpful. It is not helpful in the sense that it does not move dialogue forward. To move dialogue forward, you need to be able to talk about privilege in a way that does not reproduce privilege even as you are talking about it. See, this is why it is very much harder to talk about privilege than it is to talk about disprivilege. The language for talking about disprivilege is a well-established language. Very broadly speaking, the language of the oppressed. It's a universal language, and we understand that language very well. We do not have a corresponding language that is equally constructive in a political sense, equally promotive of dialogue to speak of privilege. So speaking of privilege, especially caste privilege, is very difficult. And until we are able to speak about it in a constructive way, in a useful way, meaningful, large-scale, effective dialogue on caste is impossible. That's really what I have to say. And now it's up to you to contradict me and tell me I'm wrong and all the other things that happen in dialogues. Thank you.
Sir, I have a basic, I would say not difference, but I have a different viewpoint.
कोई बात नहीं सबिया जी, difference ही सही.
नहीं,
आप इतना घबरा क्यों रही हैं?
हाँ, वो रंजिश, नहीं कोई बात नहीं सर. Yeah. मैं ये कहना चाह रही हूँ सर, you said that caste is an attribute, like attribute. No. It is an attribute.
No, I said caste. No.
Yeah, आपने कहा ना caste.
Caste is a relationship. It is not an attribute.
Okay.
That's exactly
fine.
what I'm saying.
So that is what
we think of it as an attribute.
Fine. So,
and that is the mistake.
Yeah, it's not an attribute, it's a relationship. Okay, yes. Fine. So that is one thing. I'll then have to think it from different. What I was thinking is that aapne kaha ki I do not mention my caste, or rather I don't exercise my caste for something.
No.
1 week back, that there is a case in India in which a girl called Sneha Pratigya Rajan or something like that in Tamil Nadu has gone ahead and fought a 9-year-old battle to get a no caste, no religion certificate, which was given to her after a long legal battle. I just want to bring this one. And you said that when you are at the stronger end of society, nobody asks you about your caste, rather something, if I'm able to gather. I happened to read a snippet about Miss India contest in which Miss India runner-up Manya Singh is a daughter of a rickshaw puller, which has been, just flashed all over the news idea, thinking that her caste was not displayed, but her class was displayed very, royally. What have you to say about these two cases, sir, from the caste perspective?
Okay, what was your first case? Was
My first question is that
somebody going
yes,
to court to get
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Relationship.
yeah.
They
See,
don't
that
want
is the
relationship. They say, no, we
yeah, yeah.
don't want.
What I mean by that is that the thing that we are calling caste is not really a thing. It is an entity that comes into existence in a relational context. There is this, with apologies to the non-Indians, but this may be more than just an Indian or subcontinental word. There is this word called aukat. Aukat means relative standing. Your standing relative to someone else or relative to society at large. So aukat is by definition a relational thing, right? A single person, Robinson Crusoe living on an island, does not have aukat because there's nobody else to compare with. Right? In society, as this term is used, it is used for your status. Roughly translated, it means relative status, where you're standing, as we say in English. So caste is that kind of thing in the sense that it is a performed thing. It's not an attribute. It's in the way that we respond to each other, in the way that society responds to us, and so on. That is what carries caste. And this is far more difficult to talk about than as if it were an attribute. But our habitually, even I speak of it, you speak of it, everybody speaks of it as though it were an attribute, because that's much more easy to speak of in that sense. And that works also in an everyday sense to say that so-and-so is of that caste, so-and-so of this caste. The case that you're mentioning about somebody going to court, this is another of the anomalies of our system. This is, or the irony, if you like. With the arrival of our new constitution in India on the 26th of January 1950, we adopted a Republican constitution, a very progressive, almost revolutionary constitution. And as part of that constitution, nobody has caste. That is why the programs of reservation had to be specially protected in the constitution, because they gave recognition to caste. This is the dilemma of modern governance. Now, in a modern state, everybody is supposed to be equal. Modern nation, everybody is supposed to be equal, in principle equal. We know that everywhere there is inequality in reality, but in principle, citizens are supposed to be equal. No country starts from zero, right? Every country has a history. How do you deal with that history? In that history, people were not equal. So you're starting your journey as a republic, that is, with a new constitution where everyone is formally equal. You're starting that journey in a situation where some people have been unequal for centuries. Unequal not just by custom, not just in practice as they are in every country, but in our country, people have been unequal by law, by caste law. So how does such a country, right, move ahead? On the one hand, we have to say that from now on, no more caste, right? Caste is over, it's abolished. On the other hand, what do we do with that history of caste oppression and so on in our history? Now that has to be addressed in some form. And the way of addressing that is policies of reservation and things like that, for which, ironically, you have to count caste. You have to recognize caste. Again, this is not something peculiar to caste. Any form of social inequality, if you wish to address it, you will have to measure it. You will have to recognize it. Therefore, you will have to recognize that people are unequal, right? So how do you do both things? How do you promote a culture where that inequality is not perpetuated or strengthened, and at the same time address the historical, undeniable historical fact of that inequality. Now, this is the dilemma that programs like reservation try to address. And this has been the irony of our legal system. Whatever decision, I don't know about this particular case you're talking about, Sabiha ji, but in law, it is not possible to get a decision like that because caste is not recognized in the first place. Abstractly, see, caste is recognized if you are claiming reservation, for example, you need to produce a certificate saying you belong to XYZ caste. That certificate, the law recognizes. But you cannot get a certificate saying you are of no caste.
Sir, it was given by the district collector. You can later on refer to it. There's quite an uproar in the society.
Yeah, I'm just telling you what the legal position is.
Yeah, yes. Sir.
Because many people have tried it. I'll tell you another famous case. This doctor from AIIMS who finally committed suicide tried for several years to get his the same thing what you're saying, to get a certificate from court saying that he was of no caste. That was not possible. He could not get it. So I'm not sure how exactly this happened in this case. We need to look that up. But as a general thing, caste is recognized legally in our country only as exception. So for particular purposes, such as reservation, the state is willing to certify through its functionaries that you belong to XYZ caste. But the generic certification that you belong to no caste, I have not heard of such a certification. And this particular case will have to be looked into because that is what the law assumes is the case. It assumes that nobody has caste because nobody has the right to ask me my caste if I'm not asking for any particular government program and so on. And in fact, that has been one of the major weapons of the upper caste. That in effect, I've written on this and you can look this up. Not just me, many people have written on this. The Constitution is passed on the 26th of January, 1950. By April, there is a court case that has been decided in the Madras High Court, where a lady called Champakam Dorairajan has gone to court saying that as a newly born citizen of India, remember that the Constitution adopted on the 1st of January, 26th of January, 1950, first adopted on 26th of January 1950, brought into being a creature that had never existed in Indian history. That creature was the unmarked citizen, pure citizen, no caste, no religion, no nothing, just citizen of India. Such a human being did not exist in India before. It only became possible because of the Constitution. Now, what happens by April? Somebody has gone to court to say that reserved seats are not available for me because of my caste. Because I happen to be Brahmin, and the seats that are reserved for, that are allotted for the Brahmins have been occupied by people who have higher grades than me. But there are other people who have lower grades than me, lower marks than me, but I can't get those seats because of I'm Brahmin, I'm not XYZ caste. And the Constitution of India tells me that I will not be discriminated against because of my caste. So the Madras High Court says, yes, you're right. The Constitution says there should be no caste discrimination. Therefore, we shall strike down the reservation policy. So we have the first amendment to our Constitution, brought about by B.R. Ambedkar, who is the law minister, and Jawaharlal Nehru, who is the prime minister at that time. 1951 is the amendment to the Constitution, where an extra section is brought in an extra line is brought into the Constitution to protect the reservation provisions from precisely this kind of challenge. Think of the irony. Why was the reservation program brought in? Please remember that the reservation program is older than the Republic of India. Reservation was born in 1932 via the Pune Pact, so-called Pune Pact, where Mahatma Gandhi had gone on a fast unto death to block the separate electorate for the depressed classes, what were then called the depressed classes and are today called the Dalits and Adivasis. Now, in return for giving up their demand for the depressed classes, they had got an assurance from Gandhi and the Congress, International Congress, that they would be given guaranteed representation in the legislative council that was going to be formed. That is the birth of reservation. Exactly what that agreement out of that pact in 1932 is adopted in the Government of India Act of 1935, which creates the schedules of castes and tribes. The phrase scheduled caste and scheduled tribe dates from 1935. That 1935 Government of India Act is a result of the Pune Pact. So this is necessary for our claim to be a modern nation to be credible. Because in a modern nation, there must be in principle equality. Everybody knows in practice inequality exists everywhere. But in principle, inequality is not acceptable. And caste was an excellent example of in principle inequality. And therefore, it had to be addressed decisively. And we addressed it, or we thought we were addressing it, via reservation. So this is the contradiction. We start a new republic, wanting all citizens to be equal, with the best of intentions. I'm not saying this was a conspiracy or anything. But at the same time, we have to address the historical inequality. Therefore, caste is treated as an exception, where the rule is meritocracy. Now, we know that in real life, it's not sheer merit that always wins, right? There's money, as you have yourself pointed out, money matters a lot in society. And there are other things, regional, alignments matter, language matters, gender matters. All of that is there. But broadly speaking, the assumption of the law is that meritocracy is the rule, or castelessness is the rule, and caste is the exception. Right? So that's the background from which I'm saying that, legally speaking, it is very hard to certify someone as being of no caste. That position is available to you, or theoretically available to you, in, say, something like the census. Let me tell you what happened to me with the census. Now, I work on census data and so on. And when the census enumerator came, usually an overworked school teacher, I tried to tell him to please put no religion for me, because I happen to be an atheist. And so I wanted, it's very simple, therefore, no religion. And that is, there is a provision in the census to say no religion. But he was very polite. He kept smiling at me, and he kept being very nice to me. And he went on entering there Hindu for me. And my wife's name happens to be a Christian name. So he entered Christian for her. And for our son, he entered Hindu. Now, I would have had to make a huge hue and cry and be rude to this poor overworked person to get my way to say that, please put no religion. Now, there are some situations where that happened, but I let it go. What I'm trying to illustrate is that theoretically, it is possible for us to deny our social identities. And many people go to great lengths to deny them. But in practice, it's not easy. So I think of myself as being without caste, but I know that that is a fiction. I know that my caste identity is working for me all the time. Let me tell you another story. When I was 19, I went to work in villages. I'm saying I'm giving you my age just to show you how innocent and foolish I was at that time. And I thought I was full of all these ideas. I thought that I went to work in a village in Rajasthan. And I said, whenever I used only my first name, I dropped my second name, and I would not tell anybody my caste. The first question you're asked, at least this is in the late 1970s, even today, the first question you're asked in most villages in India is, in Rajasthan, they would say, "The kaun ka ho?" Who do you belong to? Meaning, what caste are you? And I would say, we had these grand answers, Insan and, Hindustani and all of that kind of thing. In half an hour, I would be addressed as Sharma ji, Pandit ji. You may not speak your caste, right? But your caste speaks you. So your caste is embodied. You open your mouth and people know. Because we have long years of experience dealing with this kind of thing. So it's become a very long drawn out response to you, Sabiha ji. All I'm trying to say is that disowning social identities is a difficult task where your intentions are not the only thing that matter. A lot of other things matter. And the only honest thing to do, ultimately, in my opinion, again, this is my opinion, is to acknowledge that your social identity is working for you. For example, my name is a Hindu name, not only an upper caste name, but a Hindu name. I cannot go around saying that I think of myself as an atheist. I still get the advantages and maybe sometimes disadvantages of a Hindu identity. And if I'm a social scientist, and if I'm sensible, I'm a person with a reasonable amount of common sense, I must accept that fact. I must accept the fact that no matter what I think of myself as, the advantages and sometimes the disadvantages of my social identity will accrue to me, whether I choose them or not. And one must interact with society knowing that this is the case. And therefore, the most constructive thing we can do, those of us who happen to be in positions of privilege, is to try and deconstruct that privilege in some way, to talk about that privilege in a way that does not reproduce the privilege. That's why I think dialogue across caste is a challenge. I'm not saying it can never be done, but I'm saying it's one of our most difficult agendas in contemporary India. More questions, objections, comments?
Good evening, sir. Yes, thank you, sir, for your insights into the dynamics of dialogue and caste. So I'm not a student of like political science or sociology. So my understanding of caste is also very naive, and it's through the discussion.
As long as you're a student of life, we are all students of life.
So yes.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. So, sir, as we understand, caste, of course, it is somewhere an internalized structure somewhere. Even if we don't address it, it has its own function, very autonomous. So my question here is that in Indian consciousness, if I may call it as an Indian cultural consciousness, if I don't know if such a thing exists. So how close is the relation between, how intimate is the relation between religion and caste? So whenever we counter caste, can we do it without its embeddedness in the larger structures of religion? That's my first question, sir. And the second question is that somewhere we know that how caste is so scripted, and especially people who are in privilege. I mean, I think it is embodied in our names for that matter. It's very much out there. So we have never seen any trend where there has been an attempt to perhaps dismantle that clarity, the way the caste speaks for itself. Like we of course saw JP movement in Bihar, which was somewhat, I think it permeated down into the caste structures, and the surnames became very ambiguous. We could not identify directly. But especially when we talk about upper caste, why is there this resistance? I mean, when it especially comes to our name and its function to show the privilege, I think upper caste perhaps don't even have to talk about the privilege. It speaks for itself. It's there, embodied, scripted. Like you said, it's overwritten, it's overflowing. So, how do we understand these movements to somewhere dismantle? Because end of the day, we need to annihilate the entire structure. If that's, I mean, that's the goal, perhaps, you know?
Right.
Yeah, because it is so inherently problematic, it is so inherently based on hierarchy. So how do
Yes.
you understand these two relationships? Yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Nityaji. Let me take your second question first. That caste is, as you said, so closely scripted, and how do we like get rid of our caste identities, particularly those of us who are privileged? It's a good illustration you've taken, and the illustration of dropping of last names. There were social movements, including the JP movement, but it was not the only one. There were historically much older movements also, which tried to drop caste names and so on. Dropping of caste names is again an asymmetrical act. It is one thing for a person from a so-called lower caste to drop their caste name so that they are not identified as lower caste. And it is another thing for a caste, an upper caste person to drop their caste name so that they are not identified as upper caste. Why do I say this? I say this because for the upper caste person, dropping of the caste name is almost never decisive, in the sense that caste privilege expresses itself, your caste identity expresses itself in many ways. So simply seeking not to name your caste through your surname is not enough. And in fact, in my opinion, by dropping the caste name, we might be, in a sense, pushing back the date when dialogue across caste will be possible. Because we are, in a sense, bypassing, or we are evading the responsibility of talking about privilege. And how do you talk about privilege if you have erased it? So, for example, I mean, I'm not saying this is necessarily the only way or even the best way. I'm simply telling you what I do. And so I have decided not to drop my name, my last name, and to draw attention to it, and to speak as a person who has been shaped by these advantages, to make that a part of an account that I provide in whatever way that it is needed in public interaction. Starting from there seems to me to be a more constructive avenue, with more possibilities than anonymity. The difficulty arises from, as you have yourself pointed out, Nityaji, from the peculiarity of caste. Because caste is one of our social institutions of which two things were true at the same time. And these two things were never true at the same time of any other institution. What are these two things? One, caste is an institution that pervaded, that occupied every aspect of social life. It was everywhere. Secondly, we wanted to abolish this institution. Both these things were not true of any other institution. Religion was part of our every aspect of our lives, but nobody wanted to abolish religion. We only wanted to abolish the bad parts of religion. The what were they called, the expression, the old-fashioned expression for them? Social evils, yes. The social evils associated with religion. The burning of widows, child marriage, untouchability, whatever. To the extent that these were religious, we wanted to get rid of that part of religion without abolishing religion. It was not necessary to abolish religion. Regional cultures, we didn't want to abolish. So how do you go about abolishing something, quote unquote, abolishing something that is a fundamental part of social life? It's a huge challenge. And that's the challenge we have been living through. That's why we are having difficulty. Because on the one hand, it is an institution that pervades every aspect of our life. What we eat, who we eat with, who we marry, what kind of job we can have. Everything was decided by caste. And at the same time, we want to abolish it. So giving concrete, understandable meaning to abolish in this context is very difficult. And it's that difficulty that we are, in a sense, working through. And with other institutions, we had the standard formula: save the good, get rid of the bad. Your definition of the good and bad may be different, but everybody had some good part. Everybody had some maybe small bad part. So get rid of the good, save the, get rid of the bad, save the good. It's a perfectly robust formula. What is the good part of caste? Very hard to answer that question. So it's difficult to come up with an answer to that, to apply the same formula. So here the formula becomes abolish. What does it mean to abolish? Mostly in public life, it has meant censorship. That's what the Nehruvian era did. It basically censored talk of caste in the public domain. Effectively, there was no law saying you can't talk about caste, but in the national domain, people couldn't talk about caste. That didn't make caste go away. In fact, the caste-blind state that Nehruvianism produced with the best of intentions allowed caste inequalities to become even deeper. That's why we have the Mandal explosion, because caste kept on working below the scene, below the surface. And the surface was, we believed, was clean because we didn't talk anymore about it. And now, after they have deepened, after we have this hyper-visibility, invisibility, remember, this wasn't true before. Everybody's caste was visible before. It's only after the secularization of caste, which is available to a certain group, because they were in the right place at the right time because of their inherited advantages, that they have been able to convert their caste capital into modern secular capital, like credentials, like degrees, like industry, whatever, all the modern stuff. And we are able to say caste has nothing to do with us. Although all the big industrialists are upper caste, not just upper caste, from 2 or 3 castes. Most of the the high officials, even today, despite reservation, are upper caste, etc. Every journalists, you name it, in every position of privilege, you see the preponderance of upper castes. Along with the language that because of reservation, because of our constitution, we have abolished caste. You see what's happening. On the one hand, caste is working away busily, producing and reproducing inequalities, and we are allowing it to do that. And on the other hand, our ability to talk about this is constantly shrinking. At least that was true until the 1990s. It's this mismatch that brings us to where we are. So Nityaji, your question is a very difficult question to answer, and I'm very well aware that I haven't answered it. But what I have tried to do is to show you why it is a difficult question, why it is hard to get rid of caste. Your first question is also a complicated one, caste and religion. This is even more complicated in the Indian context because here our biggest religion is very hard to define as religion in the conventional sense. Where do the boundaries of Hinduism end? There's no one book. There's no one type of congregation. This is a very well-known problem in history. I'm not raising this in a polemical sense. I'm not saying this makes Hinduism any less than any other religion. I'm simply saying that the idea of religion is a Semitic idea. It comes from a certain context, and it has a lot to do with the history of Christianity. The definition of religion has a lot to do with the history of Christianity. Now, a religion like Confucianism, a religion like Hinduism gets to be called religion because that's the most convenient label for it, and because people are searching for parallels. X country is Muslim, Y country is Christian, therefore Z country must also be something or the other. What shall we call it? Let's call it Hindu. So the fundamental problem is that religion in our context is hard to define. And because that is hard to define, the place of the relationship between something like caste and something like religion becomes then hard to define. Is our caste underwritten by religion? You can answer yes, and you can produce a lot of evidence for it. You can also answer no and produce a fair amount of evidence for it. So again, you're very good at asking questions that don't have easy answers. So I congratulate you on that, because asking questions is what we academics value. But I'm trying to show to you why this is not just a play on words. I'm not trying to, sort of deny you an answer that I have in my pocket. I'm just trying to show you why this question is hard, and any answer I give would be problematic. So I invite you to think more about this. This is more a predicament than a, it's a situation we all find ourselves in. So we need to think about this. It's true that for a lot of people, caste does seem to be religion driven, but for some people it is not driven by religion. And there's no easy way of adjudicating this dispute.
Sir, good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon.
Thank you for this interaction and this wonderful session. I had a question where you told about caste and religion. I mean, I've just begun to understand the concept of caste. I was just introduced to this idea of caste in my first semester. I'm in my first semester of PG. So you said there have been evidences that caste has originated from religion, and we can provide evidences, which I am aware of. What do you mean when you say that there are evidences that disassociate caste from religion? I mean, there are evidences that you can show.
Okay. Yes. The shortest answer, the simplest answer to give you is in terms of the old cliche about India. I'm assuming you're from India? Or are you from one of the other countries?
Kashmir.
Oh, you're from Kashmir, of course. Yes. It's not, again, not an easy question to answer, right? I asked you a question that suddenly has become difficult to answer. I'm sorry about that. But no, I'm not sorry. I'm ashamed of the fact that it has become a difficult question. That is a different matter. We are not entering into that matter here.
Absolutely.
In the old cliche that is said about India, that everything and its opposite are true. You can find everything. You make a statement A, you can find evidence for it. You make a statement not A, you can find evidence for it. So just as you find evidence that, let's say, Manusmriti, this text called Manusmriti, if you accept that it is a religious text, which is again a debate among scholars. Can it be called, it is a law, a text that has related to law, but is it a religious text? There's a debate. Supposing we assume it's a religious text. You can find many historical evidences where the Manusmriti, the law of the Manusmriti was followed. You can find many instances where it was not followed. And the instances where it was not followed are not exceptional. There are many such instances. They are found all across the country, etc., etc. So if I want to say that, no, it may have been written in some book or something, the caste rules, they were never really followed, then I will produce all that evidence. Somebody wants to say this was a rule, it was followed, they will produce the other kind of evidence. And we will go on arguing, right? So this is what I mean when I say that it's not a debate that can be settled very easily. You can't give a quick, like clean, like slam dunk type of answer that yes, caste is religion, or no, it's not religion. It's kind of messy, like so many things, right? And it's one of the things that makes caste difficult. It's vaguely related to religion, but exactly how, to what extent, is hard to say. And even if it is related to religion, attitudes of people towards religion are also very complex. And not only complex, but changing, right? What could be done in the name of religion, any religion, 3 centuries ago is not the same as what can be done in the name of religion today, right? So things change also, even if we say that it is because of religion. What I would invite you all, since this question has come up in more than one way, what I would invite you all to think about is, where do you want to go with this question? What is it about caste that you think religion might explain? Right? And if you think about that, then reaching that destination may be possible through some other route also. So what I'm saying is that the historical record is mixed on this question. Just to state my opinion, in my opinion, the question of origins, the question of religious or other forms of justification, to me, they are not very important. What is important is, what is caste doing today? And what do you want to do about whatever it is doing? Do you want to help it along? Do you want to oppose it? Do you want to stop it doing what it is doing? These are the questions to ask. Now, whether whatever it is doing, whether it is doing so because of religion, because of something else, whether it originated in this way or that way, what is the true story of its origins? We may never have an answer to that question. What matters is what is being done in the name of caste. Just like religion, what matters to me is not what the origin of some religion is or what they are claiming and so on. What matters is what is being done to other people, what is being done to human beings in the name of religion. That is an important question. And that is a question you need to fight over. Not what is contained in a religion, or what does the religion say X or does it say Y, or an even more foolish question is A, a good religion, or B, a bad religion, so on, which are foolish questions. So what is happening to whom, why? These are always good questions to ask.
Anybody else? Zia, you want to ask a question?
Hello, sir. Thank you for your insightful speech, lecture. Actually, sir, I wanted to ask, since caste and the caste system is maintained through endogamy,
True.
and endogamy, like caste-based marriage, like marriage within the caste, and
Endogamy. Yes,
women
yes.
use endogamy, and women use as a tool to maintain caste system, because the caste is maintained by endogamy. And
Yes, but who maintains endogamy?
like see, who maintains? This is the parents. Generally, what happens? Parents used to used to marry their daughter or son in the same caste, and like they see everything, caste, social status, economic status, and then they say कि जोड़ी तो आसमानों पे बनते हैं. Like they choose everything on the name of caste, religion, and social status. I'm just trying to say that women empowerment can be major tool to abolish caste system, because when women get empowered, then they may choose their future husband or something, like as per her own decisions, not by force.
Yes, but one of the difficulties in this kind of thing, and this is again the genius of Indian society for nullifying everything. Suppose you have an intercaste marriage.
Yes.
What happens in India, or what has happened historically, is that the child of the intercaste marriage, even the partners in the intercaste marriage, usually the woman is allotted the caste of the man, and the child is allotted the caste of the father. So we are back to square one. Nothing has happened to caste.
Yes, sir, I agree with that. But what I also observe that since you talk about social capital, and there is the inequality within caste. So when when there is intercaste marriage happen, then each other caste learn many things about each other families and many things, and they improve their way of life after that.
But you're assuming that after that there is interaction. Unless the castes concerned are very close to each other anyway, socially. If the caste divide is very wide divide, and the marriage has taken place despite that, one or the other set of connections are cut off. So what you're assuming, and what a lot of people in the 1930s also assumed, is that intercaste marriages will bring communities closer. That may be an unwarranted assumption, unjustified assumption. If an intercaste marriage effectively forces the couple to take shelter in one caste group or the other, whichever is more hospitable, then in fact, such people may become more committed to caste identity. Right? Because it's like saying, new converts are more fanatical than the people who have always been. So when you come into, and it becomes a very important resource for you at a time of crisis. What Sabiha ji was saying right in the beginning, that you need family in case the marriage goes wrong. So what is family and caste and so on? It is a resource. It is your social capital that you. So if a particular caste group has become your social capital at a time of crisis, you will invest more in that group, right? So you may well become, there may be logical reasons why you become more committed to a caste than you were before. After fighting against caste to get married. So our history is full of these kinds of ironies, and that's why it's a very resilient, difficult kind of question.
Okay. Thank you.
No, I realize that I'm sounding a little pessimistic, but अब क्या किया जाए?
Also adding to that, sir, if a woman from a lower caste gets married to a man who's from an upper caste and vice versa, will the implications be same?
No.
Yeah. So it will be
Yeah,
different.
that's the short answer for you. I'm so happy to be able to give a short answer.
I mean, that's where
Yes,
the
you would
honor
have
kills.
read about what are called honor killings. There is
Yeah.
an irony for you, a contradiction, right? Honor and killing are brought together. They happen across religions also, but caste is where it's, and most of them tend to be where there was a term for this in the classical literature, anulom and pratilom. What you're talking about is pratilom, where the woman is of, if the woman happens to be of higher caste and the man is of lower caste, then this is pratilom, and it has very heavy punishment. If the man is higher caste and he, as we say, that phrase itself tells you about patriarchy. If the man takes a woman of a lower caste as his wife, it is called anulom, where the punishment is not as severe. There is also punishment for that, but not as severe. But today we have honor killing situations where people are literally killed when they marry outside their caste or sometimes religion. Yes, somebody else had something to say.
Hello, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead.
Hello. Good afternoon, sir. I'm Meenakshi. So, firstly, your lecture was really good. It was really nice listening to you, and I have got few like just 2-3 questions. First is that, sir, like what is the like? Is there any way to remove caste? Like, well, we can't remove caste. It can't be removed. It will continue. But is there any way to change the mindset of the people? And secondly, I have met a lot of people who are also sociologists and also non-sociologists. But after having a PhD degree in sociology, they fail to disfollow or unfollow caste at the time of their kids' marriage. They again try to find partners of their kids of the same caste and everything. So can you please like share your ideas about the future, or how can people change, or how can you bring the change in the society? Because despite people having so many degrees, they still like stick to those like rigid protocols, you know. So what are the ways to change these things? Because I think the caste will never go away. And secondly, I have seen many educated girls and also male and female adopting their partner's religion and caste. Why is it so? Like you are so educated. Why do they adopt things? You know, why is it so? It's just this much I wanted to ask.
Okay. Thank you, Meenakshi ji. How do we remove caste? I think we should focus on removing the effects of caste. If we focus on blocking or undoing the work that caste does, then that's the best way of removing caste. So if we directly try to remove something like caste, I don't think we will ever be able to do it.
Well, sir, I'm aware of the fact. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm aware of the fact like caste will never get removed. But what about the mindset of the people, like who are really educated, but they fail to change at the time of marriage and all? Like I met many sociologists, but you know, and I have attended their kids' weddings. Yeah, please
I was
go
just
ahead.
coming to that, but I mean, again, the short answer is that instead of removing caste or abolishing caste, which is what actually social movements and reform movements have said for a long time, or at least they used to in the past, we have to try to make caste irrelevant. not focus on abolishing it, but to try to make it irrelevant. And different ways in which we can make it irrelevant is if we don't allow it to produce the effects that it does. That's the short answer. I can give you more detail later. For your other two questions, you are working on the assumption that education will bring enlightenment. No, this is sadly an assumption that is not always justified. And I am fond of saying that our biggest problem is educated people. Uneducated people are surprisingly sensible when it comes to many things.
Well, I agree. Yeah.
Amenable to, I mean, at least they are practical. And if you take a practical approach to a problem and create a practical situation where believing in caste or whatever else you're trying to fight, where believing in such things doesn't help or is not practical, then they will stop believing in that. But educated people have a lot of illusions about themselves, and educated people don't listen because they think they're already educated. So most of our problems have to do with educated people. Now, I know that it's a cliche in most speeches. You have these politicians always seem to think that illiteracy and so on is a problem. Literacy has nothing to do with wisdom or even sense. You can lack sense completely and be highly educated. So education, don't forget that education is embedded in particularly in our context, education is embedded in our society. So in the Indian context, it is probably like that in most other places to different degrees, to a greater or lesser degree. I'm only speaking about India because this is the society I know best. Education, especially higher education, is in India first and foremost a marker of status, and only secondarily a marker of competence of some kind. In fact, the competence is completely optional. Status is mandatory. So as soon as you acquire a degree, you acquire a social status. In fact, most degrees are acquired because they connote social status. Now, whether in addition you're also competent, that is, as they say, kismat. So don't be surprised if educated people follow caste.
Thank you, sir. But, you know, like traveling all over India and to look at the intercaste and inter-religion marriages in mainland India, oh my God, that is really very shocking, you know, the impact and all, because I come from the northeastern part of India, and it's very shocking to see.
But Meenakshi, one of the sad things is that parts of India that were different are being very quickly standardized. Even the Northeast is being turned into the rest of India slowly.
Yeah, true. With time, it is getting, yeah.
Yeah, anyway, let's, other questions or comments?
Behzad sir, am I allowed to ask one another question if I have? Deshpande sir, I don't know.
Welcome back, Sabiha ji. I was missing you.
कास्ट को वैसे भी हिंदी में जाति कहते हैं, और जो कभी नहीं जाती वो जाति होती है. ओके,
हाँ, बिल्कुल.
We teach like जो कभी नहीं जाती वो जाति.
जी.
खाली रस्व और दीर्घ का फर्क है. कास्ट हिंदी वाले में रस्व है और बोइंग वाले में दीर्घ है, पर मतलब वही होता है. जो कभी नहीं जाती वो जाती है. मेरा सवाल ये है कि वैसे तो जाति किसी भी स्क्रिप्चर में, जिसको आप रिलीजन कहते हैं, जूइश, क्रिश्चियंस, मुस्लिम्स में जाति नहीं है. प्रीडोमिनेंटली जाति जो है वो हिंदू वे ऑफ लाइफ का एक पहलू है। अगर आप हिंदू को रिलीजन ना भी माने तब भी हिंदू
Indian way
वे
of
ऑफ
life.
लाइफ का एक पहलू है कि भाई आपने कुछ काम कर लिया तो आप एक पर्टिकुलर जाति में हो गए, फिर किसी और ने कुछ और काम किया तो वो पर्टिकुलर किसी और जाति में हो गए। सवाल ये है कि ये प्रीडोमिनेंटली वे ऑफ लाइफ जो है वो डोमिनेंटली वे ऑफ लाइफ कैसे बन गया और क्यों बन गया, ये मेरे को आज तक समझ में नहीं आया। क्योंकि ये तो वे ऑफ लाइफ था कि भाई आप में को याद करने की बहुत क्षमता है तो आप पंडित बन गए, आप में ताकत है तो आप लाइक बन गए, तलवार उठा ली, आप में कैलकुलेशन बहुत अच्छा है तो आप व्यापार करने लगे, और शायद जो कुछ नहीं कर पाते थे वो दूसरों की सेवा वगैरह XYZ जो कुछ भी उन्होंने कहा, मनुस्मृति में कहा, जो कुछ भी कहा। सवाल ये है कि ऐसा नॉट सो डोमिनेंटली पहलू जो है वो इस देश का सबसे पहला पहलू कैसे बन गया कि पहले लोग प्रेसिडेंट बाद में कोई बनता है उसकी जाति पहले आ जाती है। कल गुलाम नबी आजाद साहब कह रहे थे, मुझे इतनी शर्म आई बिकॉज आई एम अ प्रैक्टिसिंग मुस्लिम, कि इस देश में कभी भी एक मुसलमान अपने आप को प्राइम मिनिस्टर के रूप में देख नहीं सकता। मुझे लगा सबसे शर्मनाक बात उन्होंने कह दी है। आई डोंट नो व्हाई ही सेड सो। PM साहब के प्यार में बह के कह दिया कि पता नहीं किसमें कह दिया, लेकिन कहा कुछ उन्होंने ऐसा ही। अब सवाल ये है कि जो चीज डोमिनेंटली नहीं है उसको आप इतना डोमिनेंट बना क्यों देते हैं? आपने वो कहा, सही बात है, इट इज यूज्ड ईदर फॉर पॉलिटिक्स और फॉर सुविधा, और फॉर is it a psychological factor of being in a place where you feel very good and secure, and that is why jati never goes? Is it like that, sir? Is it?
I think it is about privilege, and because caste is relational, privilege is also the caste privilege is also relational. So if you are whether knowingly or unknowingly, agar aapki isme aastha hai, I think stick to English because not everybody might understand Hindi. If you believe in caste, then you believe in that relational status. Therefore, you have a stake in others being lower than you. And often you justify it by saying that there are yet others who are higher than you. So that ye fir wo औकात wali baat aa jati hai. So you develop a stake in that because of this relational aspect, and you can't have everyone being the same, because then caste will lose meaning, because caste is about difference and hierarchy. So you can maintain hierarchy only by claiming difference, and if you claim difference, that then the door is open to claiming hierarchy. If you admit everyone is the same, then you can't claim hierarchy. And that's the thing. And in the end, of course, like with everything else, it depends on movements. On no privileged class or group anywhere in history has happily given up its privilege and said, "Ye lo, hamari privilege humne aapko wapas lauta di, hame kuch nahi chahiye." Nobody is like that. So privilege will have to be taken away, and people who are invested in this hierarchical relationship will have to be denied access to that hierarchical relationship. So that is how, and some of this is going to be, as we already know, some of, like in any serious social movement, some of this is going to be not so pretty or nice, and it's going to be pretty nasty actually. And it's again a question of historical luck as to how bad things get, or whether they are kept within bounds. But just to address this question of it's primarily Hindu, I think it is primarily Indian, because every religion that has had long roots in India has some form of the caste system within it. Including, it may not be exactly the same, but the similar kinds of distinctions operate within every religion that is operative in India.
Because sir, basically there was a conversion. People who converted to other religions.
Whatever the reason.
Otherwise, Yeah. So you don't see a Dhobi or an Ansari if you go to Dubai or Saudi or Yemen or Libya.
Yes.
But
yes.
you see that in Indian Muslim subcontinent, and they try to avail the facility. It's like that, basically because of that. I
हाँ
think.
हाँ, और आज भी आप जानती होंगे, मुझसे बेहतर आप जानती होंगे कि अलग अलग कब्रिस्तान होते हैं और मस्जिद
जी
में
जी,
अलग जगह मिलती है
बिल्कुल
बैठने को, सामने
बिल्कुल
वाली
बिल्कुल
कतार में
बिल्कुल
नहीं बैठने दिया जाता. Same thing in churches. They have separate churches, separate burial grounds, and seating in many churches is caste based. And Sikhism also has caste. So I think it is truer to say that caste is Indian than necessarily Hindu. Of course, it has the longest roots in Hinduism. But today, it doesn't matter whether the roots of something are 5,000 years old or only 1,200 years old. The effect on the present is the same. So what we have to fight is the effects of caste. It does not matter where its origins are. And I don't think we need to get involved in whether it's only Hindu or whether now everybody has it. And therefore, we have to, whatever form it is in and the effects it is producing, we have to try and fight that to the best of our ability. And the first thing about fighting it is to be aware of it. And that's what I am trying to do, to make people aware of it, that caste is not only out there somewhere. See, we have this elsewhereization, what I call, it's a horrible word, but it expresses what I have to say. With bad things that everybody agrees are bad, there is an elsewhereization effect. If it is agreed that it is bad, it can't be near where I am. It must be far away. It must be someone else who is, who is captured by it, or someone else who is affected by it. And that is the first thing to get rid of, and realize that it's a relational thing. तो वो एक हाथ वाली ताली का हिसाब है सबिहा जी, कि अब ताली की आवाज आपको आ रही है तो दो हाथ हैं कहीं.
Sir, I would just like to share a few more things. Like, I
Yes.
personally somewhere believe that, or feel that it's very important to understand the origin of any phenomena, because unless we capture that, the entire discourse then is very, very precarious. So I think somewhere the Hindu way of putting or understanding of the caste is very clearly very Brahmanical. Of course, it permeates and pervades into every sphere, but that does not change the fact that the system of knowledge is around the caste remains highly Brahmanical, even present day, in its all practicalities, realities, through performances, through discourses. It holds that position. And so second point, I feel that what you said, I do agree about elsewhereization. In psychoanalysis, we talk about something called externalization of our own bad parts on the other. That is what Freud talks about, projection. So somewhere can we also understand caste from that perspective, that all these divisions and these differentiations are somewhere a reflection of a unified entity of a human being, through whether it is a discourse through labor or whatever we may rationalize it, in order to make it more pragmatic and rational. But it remains essentially very problematic. And somewhere I feel even to gain that psychoanalytical perspective into the dynamics of caste is something very, very needed and necessary, so that how do we project our own difficult negative parts onto the other and create these divisions. So I just wanted to express that, to engage in a dialogue. Thank you.
Okay. No, that's very interesting. And the only comment I have is that I'm talking about historical time. Time is as you probably know better than me, is how shall I put it? Dormant or not very active component of a psychoanalytic frame. The kind of duration or intervals that psychoanalysis can think of are very different from historical time, right? In a concrete sense where things happened, there was a certain social system, a mode of production, whatever. I have been concerned mainly with historical time. And in that sense, to me, origins are, it's very hard for a stories of origin or accounts of origin to escape controversy or debate. And in that sense, it's a very, if you require the settling of questions of origin before you can act on the effects of something, then you're putting yourself at a disadvantage, I feel, because historical questions of this large questions of this sort are very difficult to settle conclusively. And if a conclusive historical answer becomes essential for you, then you must reconcile yourself to a long period of indeterminacy. And it is in order to bypass that I devalue the importance of origins as far as I'm concerned. But as I said, this is my opinion, and it need not be shared by others.
Sir, it's 5 already, but we have one more question if you'd like to address that too.
Sure.
Can I take that? Okay. So this question is from Urusa, and she asks, is the caste system so stubborn because it is simply a convenient way of keeping order and maintaining that order through dominance of upper caste and docility of the so-called lower classes? So are we as a society just clinging to order then? And sir, about providing social and cultural capital as means to reduce the effect of caste, but we don't see that happening. Is it ultimately just that the society is afraid of chaos and looks at caste as maintaining order? I think there's a problem with her internet connection, so she couldn't ask it.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for the question. I'm sorry, I didn't get the name of the person.
It's Urusa.
Kurusa. Achha. Thank you, Kurusa, for Urusa. Achha.
Yes.
For your question. Again, I'm not exactly sure how to go about answering what you have asked. How do we understand the need for order? Now, there is something about order that seems self-evidently desirable. Nobody wants anarchy, right? And that's where the danger lies, because it's not just order that society is maintaining. It is a certain kind of order, an order where the distribution of power, privilege, disprivilege, and powerlessness, etc., is of a particular kind. You can have order under a variety of social circumstances, but it is a particular social arrangement that is sought to be protected. Effectively, whoever is dominant in society wishes that arrangement to continue. And this desire for the current arrangement to continue is expressed as a desire for order. And that if you don't have this specific type of arrangement, you will have chaos. I think that is a false contrast. You can have order under many different kinds of dispensation. So when there is a demand for change, even a revolutionary demand for change, the demand is not to replace order with chaos. It is to replace order of one kind with order of another kind. So in that sense, the desire for order should be taken as common, and in the way of algebra should drop out of the equation, because it is on both sides of the equation, right? And what we are left with then is disputes about social arrangements. We are left with disputes about distribution of power. And these are very resilient questions. They have been there in every society. And that's what social change is about. Social change is about changing who has how much power. And that those with power are, historically speaking, reluctant to let go of it. And that's why you have resistance to change. But just to add to this, any lasting system of power is ultimately based on ideology. Because pure force is a very inefficient, very expensive in every sense mechanism. So you can't have societies that are stable for a long period based on sheer power. You have to have ideologies, which means that somehow the powerless have to be persuaded that despite their being powerless, it is a good or at least an inevitable situation. And that is achieved through ideologies of different kinds. So much of the struggle to change the social order, much of it is an ideological struggle.
All right, sir. So do we conclude here?
It's up to you. I'm in the business of talking, so.
Right. Do we have any more questions or comments?
Okay, so thank you. It was nice talking to all of you. And it's very
All right,
strange
sir.
for me, this online business, but what to do? We are having to do it this way.
Right. Thank you so much for taking time out for us today. It was an absolute pleasure listening to you.